The top floor of the Whitmore building stood silent except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. Charles Whitmore's penthouse, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, felt different that evening. The usual coldness of the modern furnishings was replaced by an unexpected warmth, stemming from the presence of Jamila Thompson. Jamila moved through the space with familiarity, having cleaned it countless times over the past year. But tonight was different. She wasn't here as the housekeeping staff. The stack of fresh towels she'd brought up earlier sat forgotten on the marble counter. Charles sat at his desk, pretending to review documents, but his eyes kept drifting to Jamila as she organized the living room. The tension between them had been building for months, small touches, lingering glances, conversations that went beyond employer and employee. Both knew they were crossing a line, but neither seemed able to stop. The evening started like any other. Jamila was finishing her usual cleaning routine when Charles returned early from a board meeting. He loosened his tie, dropped his briefcase, and asked if she'd join him for a drink. One drink turned into two, and their usual polite conversation evolved into something more personal. They discussed their lives, their dreams. Charles spoke about the pressure of running his father's company, the loneliness of his position. Jamila shared stories about her community in Harlem, her aspirations to start a support program for single mothers. The physical distance between them on the leather couch gradually disappeared. The consequences of their actions didn't register until the following morning. Jamila arrived at work, attempting to maintain professional distance, but the memory of their night together lingered. Charles tried to catch her eye, to have a moment alone, but the busy household staff made privacy impossible. Weeks passed, and their encounter remained unaddressed. Charles noticed changes in Jamila. She seemed distracted, avoided his presence, took longer breaks. The pregnancy test results shook her world one Tuesday morning in the staff bathroom. The plastic stick with its two pink lines threatened everything she'd worked for. Jamila spent days wrestling with the decision to tell Charles. She watched him from afar, conducting business calls, hosting meetings with real estate developers, living in a world so separate from hers. The weight of their social differences became more apparent with each passing day. When she finally gathered the courage to tell him, the conversation happened in his study. Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, a position of power he unconsciously assumed. Jamila stood, her hands clasped tightly together, as she delivered the news. Charles's reaction cycled through shock, confusion, and concern. He spoke of practical solutions, financial support, private healthcare, discretion. But his words revealed the gulf between them. He talked about handling the situation as if it were a business transaction, while Jamila grappled with the reality of carrying their child in a world that would judge them both. The discussion escalated. Charles suggested arrangements that would keep everything quiet, protected from public scrutiny. Jamila felt the sting of shame in his proposals, though he didn't intend it. She watched his face as he outlined plans, speaking about their child as if it were a problem to solve rather than a life to nurture. The breaking point came when Charles mentioned his board of directors, his company's image, his family's reputation. Each word widened the chasm between them. Jamila stood, her decision made. She wouldn't raise their child in the shadows, treated like a secret to be managed. Without drama or accusations, Jamila walked out of the study. Charles called after her, but his words couldn't bridge the gap their conversation had created. She collected her belongings from the staff room, ignoring the curious glances of her co-workers. The elevator ride to the lobby felt eternal. Jamila touched her stomach, still flat but carrying a secret that would change everything. As she pushed through the revolving doors onto Fifth Avenue, she didn't look back at the towering building that had been her workplace for the past year. Charles watched her departure from his window, his hands pressed against the glass. The city continued its usual bustle below, unaware of the drama unfolding in the penthouse above. He remained there long after Jamila disappeared into the crowd, understanding that something precious had slipped through his fingers, but not yet comprehending the full magnitude of what he'd lost. 3 days passed without any word from Jamila. Charles checked his phone obsessively, called her apartment, and even drove past her building twice. On the 4th day, he received a call from Mrs. Peterson, his head of housekeeping, informing him that Jamila hadn't shown up for work all week and wasn't responding to calls. Charles sat in his office, staring at the space where Jamila usually dusted his awards and arranged fresh flowers. The cleaning service sent a replacement, but everything felt wrong. Files remained untouched on his desk as he made call after call, trying to locate her. He contacted hospitals first, then police stations. Each negative response increased his anxiety. The police officer who took his missing person report seemed disinterested, noting that adults had the right to disappear if they chose to. Charles's status as her employer, rather than family member, limited the information he could receive. During sleepless nights, memories of their time together haunted him. He recalled conversations about her neighborhood, her friends, her favorite places. Each memory became a potential clue. During the day, he sent his security team to check these locations, but they returned empty-handed. Meanwhile, Jamila was fighting her own battles across town. She'd moved in with her cousin in the Bronx, taking only what she could carry in one suitcase. The pregnancy made her morning shifts at the diner difficult. She rushed to the bathroom between serving customers, trying to hide her morning sickness. Her new life was a stark contrast to the luxury she'd left behind. The diner's fluorescent lights highlighted the dark circles under her eyes. Regular customers noticed her fatigue but assumed it was from working double shifts. Nobody knew about the baby growing inside her, or about the father who lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. Charles hired private investigators, but their reports led nowhere. Jamila had withdrawn her last paycheck in cash. Her phone was disconnected. Her former apartment was already rented to someone else. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. The guilt ate at him constantly. During board meetings, his mind wandered to their last conversation. He replayed his words, recognizing how they must have sounded to her. His attempts to solve everything with money and discretion now seemed shallow and insensitive. Depression set in. Charles stopped attending social events. His sister noticed his change in behavior during their weekly dinners, but he couldn't explain. How could he tell his family that he'd fallen in love with his housekeeper, gotten her pregnant, and lost them both? Jamila's days blurred together. Work, sleep, doctor's appointments at free clinics where nobody asked questions. She heard whispers about people looking for her, men in suits asking questions in her old neighborhood. She moved again, this time to a smaller apartment in a different part of the city. The pregnancy progressed. Her uniform at the diner grew tight. The manager, a kind woman named Rosa, noticed but didn't pry. Instead, she assigned Jamila easier shifts and slipped her extra food at the end of the day. Still, making ends meet became increasingly difficult. Charles threw himself into work, developing new properties across the city. Each project took him into different neighborhoods, and he found himself scanning crowds, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. He donated to local clinics and community centers, wondering if she might seek help there. His search became more desperate as weeks turned into months. He visited her old church, spoke to former neighbors, and even hired a woman who claimed to be psychic. Each dead end intensified his regret. The more time passed, the more he understood what he'd lost. Back in the Bronx, Jamila watched her belly grow, talking to the baby when she was alone. She told stories about its father, not the cold businessman who worried about his reputation, but the men who had shared his dreams with her over late-night conversations. The men who could have been, if circumstances were different. Charles's private investigators eventually stopped sending reports. There was nothing new to report. The last photo they had of her was from a security camera at a bus station, taken the week after she left. In it, she wore a heavy coat despite the warm weather, perhaps already hiding her condition. The city continued its relentless pace around them both. Charles attended charity galas and board meetings, his smile never reaching his eyes. Jamila served coffee to strangers, keeping her head down when business types entered the diner. They existed in the same city but in completely different worlds. At night, they both lay awake, thinking of what could have been. Charles imagined a different reaction to her news, one where he'd chosen love over appearance. Jamila imagined a world where their differences didn't matter, where their child could exist without shame or secrecy. The summer faded into autumn. Leaves in Central Park turned golden, visible from Charles's window where he still sometimes stood, remembering. In the Bronx, Jamila watched the same leaves fall from a cracked window in her apartment, one hand resting on her growing belly, the other holding a worn photograph she couldn't bring herself to throw away. 8 years had passed since Jamila's disappearance. Charles maintained his routine of visiting children's homes and community centers across New York, a habit born from his search that evolved into genuine community involvement. Today's visit brought him to Hope's Haven, a shelter in Brooklyn. The building needed repairs, water stains marked the ceiling, and the paint peeled in corners. Children played in the common room, their laughter a stark contrast to the worn surroundings. Charles walked through with the director, discussing funding needs, when a small commotion caught his attention. A boy, around 7 or 8, darted past them chasing a tennis ball. As he bent to retrieve it, something glinted at his neck. Charles froze. The necklace was distinctive, a simple silver chain with a small elephant pendant. He'd given that necklace to Jamila on her birthday, months before everything fell apart. "That's Malik," the director said, noticing Charles's sudden interest. "Been with us 3 months now. Bright kid, but keeps to himself mostly." Charles approached the boy carefully, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's an interesting necklace you have there." Malik's hand instinctively went to the pendant, protective. His features struck Charles, something familiar in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. "It was my mom's," Malik said, his voice quiet but clear. "She said it was from someone special, someone who could help us if things got bad." He studied Charles with a directness that felt uncomfortable, as if the boy could see right through him. The director filled in some details. Malik's mother had passed away recently, a car accident on a rainy night. She'd been living in Queens, working multiple jobs, active in community organizing. The boy had no other known family. Charles sat with Malik in the shelter's small library. Books lined the walls, many with broken spines and dog-eared pages. The boy clutched his necklace as he spoke about his mother, how she helped other women in their neighborhood, how she told him stories about a man who lived in a tower like a prince. "She said he was rich and important," Malik continued, "but that sometimes important people forget what really matters." His words hit Charles like physical blows. They were exactly the kind of thing Jamila would say. The conversation revealed more parallels. Malik shared his mother's love of reading, her habit of humming while she worked, her way of helping others even when they had little themselves. Each detail confirmed what Charles already suspected, though he kept his reactions carefully neutral. Other children came and went from the library, but Malik stayed, seemingly comfortable in Charles's presence. He showed Charles his schoolwork, proudly displaying math problems solved with careful precision. The boy's intelligence and determination reminded Charles of himself at that age. The director eventually called Malik for dinner. Before leaving, the boy hesitated. "Mom said if I ever met someone who recognized this necklace, I should ask them about elephants in Central Park." He touched the pendant again. "Do you know what that means?" Charles remembered the day clearly, he and Jamila watching children ride the Central Park carousel, its carved elephant Jamila's favorite. They'd talked about taking their own children there someday. The memory he'd buried for years surfaced fresh and raw. The shelter's evening routine continued around them, children lining up for dinner, staff members checking homework, phones ringing at the front desk. But Charles felt suspended in time, watching Malik walk away, seeing hints of Jamila in his movements. That night, in his penthouse, Charles pulled out the box he kept hidden in his desk. Inside were newspaper clippings about Jamila's accident, notes from his years of searching, and a matching elephant pendant he'd never had the chance to give her. He spread the articles across his desk, reading details he'd memorized years ago. The official report was simple: single car accident on a wet road, driver pronounced dead at the scene. No passengers. No witnesses. But now, knowing about Malik, every detail took on new significance. The boy's age matched the timeline. His features, his mannerisms, the stories his mother told him, it all pointed to one conclusion. Charles stayed up late into the night, making calls to his lawyers and investigators. He needed to know everything about Malik's situation, about Jamila's life in Queens, about the community she'd built. Each piece of information filled gaps in a story he'd been trying to complete for 8 years. Rain fell outside his window, much like the night of Jamila's accident. Charles watched the drops trace patterns on the glass, thinking about second chances and redemption. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Malik slept in a shelter bed, holding his mother's necklace, unaware that his life was about to change dramatically. The following week, Charles ventured into Queens, specifically the neighborhood where Jamila had spent her final years. The area was a mix of small businesses, apartment buildings, and community centers. Signs in multiple languages advertised local services. This was a different world from his Manhattan circles. His arrival drew immediate attention. His expensive suit and car marked him as an outsider. People watched from storefronts and windows as he walked down the main street. He'd purposely come without his usual security detail, understanding it would only create more barriers. The first few attempts at conversation met with polite but firm dismissals. Shop owners claimed no knowledge of Jamila, though their eyes showed recognition at her name. A group of women outside a laundromat whispered among themselves when he passed, one making a phone call shortly after. At a small Caribbean restaurant, Charles finally found someone willing to talk. The owner, Marion, remembered Jamila as a regular customer but claimed no close relationship. As she wiped down tables, she mentioned that someone else might be more helpful, a woman named Aisha who ran the community center 3 blocks down. The community center occupied the first floor of an old brownstone. Children's artwork decorated the windows, and a sign advertised free ESL classes. Inside, Charles found organized chaos, kids doing homework, women attending a job skills workshop, elderly men playing dominoes. Aisha Jefferson wasn't what Charles expected. She was younger than him, probably in her early 30s, with an air of authority that commanded respect. When he entered her office, she was on the phone discussing funding for after-school programs. She made him wait 15 minutes before acknowledging his presence. "So you're Charles Whitmore," she said, not offering to shake hands. "Took you long enough to find us." Her direct approach caught him off guard. She knew exactly who he was and why he was there. The conversation that followed was tense. Aisha had been Jamila's closest friend and confidant. She knew everything about their relationship, the pregnancy, his reaction. She'd helped Jamila find work when she first arrived in Queens, watched her struggle and eventually thrive. "You want to know about her life here?" Aisha's voice carried a challenge. She worked 3 jobs at first. Cleaned offices at night, waited tables during the day, did bookkeeping for local businesses on weekends. All while carrying your child. Charles listened as Aisha detailed Jamila's journey. How she'd started by helping other single mothers with childcare, which grew into organizing support groups. She'd taken classes at the community college, learned grant writing, and eventually started programs to help women escape domestic violence and poverty. "She built something meaningful here," Aisha continued. "Something your money couldn't buy." These women trusted her because she'd walked in their shoes. She understood their struggles in a way you never could. The conversation shifted to Malik. Aisha's protective instincts were clear. She questioned Charles's intentions, his sudden interest after so many years. "That boy has already lost his mother. What makes you think you deserve to be in his life now?" Charles shared his own story, the years spent searching, the guilt, the regret. Aisha listened but remained skeptical. She'd seen too many promises broken, too many communities used for publicity stunts by wealthy benefactors. As their discussion continued, people came and went from the center. Each person who entered greeted Aisha with respect and familiarity. This was more than a community center, it was a family that Jamila had helped build. "If you want to understand who Jamila became," Aisha finally said, "you need to understand this place. These people. The work she did here." She handed him a folder, documentation of programs Jamila had developed, photos of community events, letters from women she'd helped. The material painted a picture of a woman far different from the quiet housekeeper he'd known. Jamila had become a leader, an advocate, a force for change. Her influence extended beyond the neighborhood, reaching other community centers across the city. Charles left the center with the folder and a challenge from Aisha. If he wanted to know more about Jamila's life and connect with Malik, he would need to prove himself to the community. Not with money, but with genuine involvement and understanding. Walking back to his car, Charles noticed details he'd missed earlier, the murals celebrating community leaders, including one of Jamila. The small businesses supporting each other. The web of relationships and support systems that Jamila had helped strengthen. In his Manhattan office that evening, Charles studied the contents of Aisha's folder. Each document revealed more about the woman Jamila had become, the legacy she'd left behind. The contrast between his world of corporate deals and her world of community service became starker with each page. The final item in the folder was a handwritten letter from Jamila to the women in her support group, dated just weeks before her death. Her words spoke of resilience, dignity, and the power of community. Charles read it multiple times, recognizing the strength he'd first fallen in love with, now transformed into something even more powerful. The transition from Manhattan executive to community volunteer didn't come naturally to Charles. He started by attending weekly meetings at the center, sitting quietly in the back, observing. The locals regarded him with suspicion, whispering about the rich man in expensive clothes who kept showing up. Charles made a conscious decision to adapt. He traded his suits for casual wear, left his luxury car at home, and took the subway to Queens. He listened more than he spoke, learning about the daily challenges faced by community members, housing issues, healthcare costs, educational barriers. His first real involvement came when the center's heating system broke down in early winter. Instead of simply writing a check, he worked with local contractors to find an affordable solution. He spent days in the basement with the maintenance crew, learning about the building's infrastructure problems. "You're getting your hands dirty now, rich man," commented Marco, the maintenance supervisor, as Charles helped install new pipes. The nickname stuck, but its tone shifted from mocking to casual acceptance over time. The physical work was new to Charles, leaving him with aching muscles and a deeper appreciation for blue-collar jobs. The women's support group, Jamila's primary legacy, initially resisted his presence. These were women who had faced domestic violence, poverty, and discrimination. Trust came slowly. Charles learned to check his privilege, to stop offering quick financial solutions to complex social problems. Maria, a single mother of 3, challenged him during one meeting. "You think throwing money at problems fixes everything? My kids need a safe neighborhood, good schools, and jobs with dignity. Can your money buy that?" Her words echoed Jamila's last conversation with him years ago. Charles immersed himself in understanding the community's needs. He attended city council meetings, studied urban development policies, and learned about systemic barriers facing low-income neighborhoods. The executive skills he'd developed over years proved useful in different ways, organizing resources, navigating bureaucracy, building networks. Aisha watched his efforts with careful scrutiny. She assigned him increasingly challenging tasks, helping women prepare for job interviews, tutoring kids in math, organizing food drives. Each task taught him something new about the community Jamila had loved. The breakthrough came during a crisis. One of the program participants, Sophia, faced eviction with her young children. Charles's instinct was to pay her rent, but Aisha stopped him. Instead, they worked together to negotiate with the landlord, connect Sophia with legal aid, and help her develop a sustainable financial plan. "Now you're starting to understand," Aisha told him afterward. "It's not about quick fixes. It's about empowering people to solve their own problems." Through community members, Charles learned more about Jamila's later years. She'd become known for her practical approach to helping others. She taught financial literacy classes, helped women start small businesses, and always made time to mentor younger community members. The center's after-school program became Charles's favorite involvement. He found himself looking forward to helping kids with homework, particularly mathematics. Many reminded him of Malik, bright, eager to learn, but facing obstacles he'd never encountered in his privileged upbringing. During this time, Charles discovered Jamila's collection of journals at the center. She documented everything: program ideas, success stories, challenges faced by community members. Her writing revealed a sharp analytical mind and deep compassion. The woman he'd known as his housekeeper had become a sophisticated community organizer. One entry particularly struck him: "Real change doesn't come from top-down charity. It comes from building bridges between communities, from understanding that we're all connected." The words could have been directed at him personally. As months passed, Charles's presence became normal at the center. He learned everyone's names, their stories, their dreams. He celebrated their successes, new jobs, college acceptances, business launches, and supported them through setbacks. The community's perception of him shifted gradually. He was no longer just the rich man from Manhattan, but Charles who helps with math homework, or Charles who fixed the heating. The transformation wasn't about losing his identity but expanding it. Through it all, Malik remained in the back of his mind. Each interaction with the community helped Charles understand the world Jamila had built for their son. He was learning to be worthy of that world, to deserve a place in it. 1 year into his involvement, during the center's anniversary celebration, Aisha handed him a photo album. Inside were pictures of Jamila at various community events, leading workshops, celebrating graduations, organizing protests. The final page held a note in her handwriting: "Sometimes the longest journey is from the head to the heart." Charles understood then that his integration into the community wasn't just about proving himself worthy of knowing Malik. It was about completing the journey Jamila had tried to start him on years ago, the journey from privilege to understanding, from power to empowerment. The annual Community Leadership Conference was scheduled at the Queen's Community Center. Charles arrived early, helping set up chairs in the main hall. The agenda listed various speakers, including a special guest, a successful community organizer from Harlem. His heart nearly stopped when he saw the name, Jamila Thompson. Confusion spread through the room as people realized the connection. Charles stood frozen by the registration table, his mind racing. Aisha approached him, her expression unreadable. She survived the accident, she said quietly. But she didn't want to be found. The hall filled quickly with community members, activists, and local leaders. Charles retreated to the back, watching the door. When Jamila entered, time seemed to stop. She looked different, older, more confident, wearing a professional suit instead of a housekeeping uniform. She didn't notice him at first. Her presentation focused on grassroots organizing and community empowerment. Her voice carried authority as she discussed strategies for social change. This wasn't the same woman who had left his penthouse 8 years ago. She was a leader, respected and accomplished. During the Q&A session, Charles raised his hand. The moment Jamila saw him, her professional demeanor cracked slightly. She recovered quickly, but her hands gripped the podium tighter. "Mr. Whitmore," she acknowledged, her voice steady. "What's your question?" The tension in the room became palpable. Most attendees knew their history, and whispers spread through the crowd. Charles stood, aware of all eyes on him. How do we ensure that privileged communities don't just provide charity, but create real partnerships for change? Jamila's response was measured but pointed. She spoke about the difference between handouts and empowerment, about the importance of listening to communities rather than imposing solutions. Every word seemed directed at their shared past. After the session, Charles tried to approach her, but community members formed a protective barrier around Jamila. Some faced him with hostile expressions, others with concern for Jamila. He heard fragments of harsh whispers, "Has no right. After all this time. Should leave her alone." Finally, Aisha intervened, creating a space for them to talk. But Jamila shook her head. "I have nothing to say to him," she stated firmly. The rejection was public and clear. Charles felt the weight of dozens of judgmental stares. One elderly woman from the center spoke up. "Child, sometimes we need to face our past to move forward." Others murmured agreement. The community that had come to accept Charles now witnessed his vulnerability, his genuine desire to make amends. Jamila remained unmoved. "I've moved forward," she declared. "I built a life without his help. I raised a son without his money. I don't need his guilt or his apologies now." The mention of their son hung in the air. Community members exchanged glances, some knowing about Malik, others putting the pieces together. Charles took a step forward. "Jamila, please. Not for me, but for Dash." "Don't," she cut him off. "You lost the right to discuss him when you treated us like a problem to be managed." Her words echoed their last conversation in his penthouse, but now she spoke from a position of power, not vulnerability. The confrontation attracted attention from other conference attendees. People gathered at the edges of the room, watching the drama unfold. Some filmed with their phones, forcing Aisha to request privacy. Charles maintained his composure, years of community work having taught him humility. "You're right," he said softly. "I handled everything wrong. But I've spent years trying to understand, to change, to be worthy of Dash." "Worthy?" Jamila laughed bitterly. "You think a few months of community service makes up for years of absence? For treating me like a scandal to be contained?" Each word carried the weight of years of pain and anger. The situation escalated as more people joined the discussion, some defending Charles's recent contributions to the community, others supporting Jamila's right to reject his presence. The conference schedule derailed as this personal drama took center stage. Through it all, Charles stayed calm, accepting the criticism, the anger, the judgment. His years in the community had taught him to listen, to absorb, to understand pain without trying to fix it immediately. But when Jamila turned to leave, he made one final attempt. "I know about the accident," he said. "I know you survived. I know about everything you've built here. And I know about Malik. The mention of their son's name stopped her at the door, but she didn't turn around. The room fell silent, waiting for her response. The community held its breath, witnessing a moment of truth between two people whose lives had diverged and now forcefully reconnected, with years of unspoken words hanging between them. The tension in the conference room was broken by the sound of running footsteps. Malik burst through the side door, out of breath. He must have run from the after-school program upstairs. "Stop," he shouted, his voice echoing through the silent room. Everyone turned to look at the boy. Charles noticed he still wore the elephant necklace. Malik moved to stand between them, looking first at Charles, then at Jamila. "I know who you are," he said to Charles. "I've known since you started coming to the center." Jamila's composure cracked. "Malik, you shouldn't be here. Go back upstairs." But the boy stood his ground, showing the same determination Charles had seen in Jamila years ago. "Mom, I found the letters," Malik announced. "The ones you kept in the blue box under your bed. I know he's my father." The revelation caused a fresh wave of murmurs through the crowd. Aisha tried to usher people out, but most stayed, transfixed by the unfolding drama. Malik continued, his voice growing stronger. "I've been watching him. He helps kids with math homework. He fixed the heating when it broke. He's not the same person from your letters." Charles remained silent, understanding that this was Malik's moment. The boy turned to address the room. "Everyone here talks about second chances. About forgiveness. About building bridges. Isn't that what Mom always taught us?" Several community members nodded, some wiping tears. They'd watched Malik grow up, heard Jamila's teachings about redemption and community healing. Now her son used those same lessons to challenge her. "I want to know my father," Malik declared. "Not because he's rich, but because he's trying. He's been here every week, learning what you taught him, Mom. About community. About helping others. About doing the work." Jamila's stern expression softened as she looked at her son. Charles recognized the look. It was the same one she'd had years ago when talking about her dreams for the community. But when she spoke, her voice was firm. "It's not that simple, Malik." "Why not?" Malik challenged. "You always say that healing starts with truth. Well, here's the truth, I need both of you. The community needs both of you." An elderly woman stepped forward, Ms. Rose, a longtime center member. "Child's got a point, Jamila. We've all watched Charles change. Maybe it's time to practice what you preach about reconciliation." The room fell quiet again, waiting for Jamila's response. She looked at Malik, then at Charles, then at the community members who had become her family. Years of built-up defenses seemed to war with the principles she'd spent years teaching others. Malik took his mother's hand, then reached for Charles's. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Jamila allowed her son to pull her closer. The three stood in a triangle, connected by Malik but separated by years of unspoken words. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Charles said softly. "I'm asking for a chance to be part of his life. Part of the community you've built. Not as a benefactor, but as someone who wants to learn and contribute." Malik squeezed both their hands. "Mom always says that true strength is knowing when to let go of anger," he said. "And that love is stronger than pride." The words hit home. These were Jamila's own teachings, reflected back through their son. She looked at Malik, seeing both his father's determination and her own strength in his face. The community watched, holding their breath, as Jamila finally spoke. "We'll need rules," she said. "Boundaries. And you'll have to earn trust, not just mine, but the community's." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was an opening, a possibility. The room exhaled collectively, understanding they were witnessing not just a family reunion, but a testimony to the power of community healing. Malik beamed, still holding both their hands. In that moment, he was both the bridge between his parents and the embodiment of everything Jamila had built: strength, resilience, and the courage to believe in change. In Aisha's office, away from the crowd, Charles, Jamila, and Malik sat in an uncomfortable triangle. The small space felt charged with 8 years of unspoken words. Aisha stood guard at the door, ensuring their privacy while staying within earshot. "I don't want your money," Jamila stated immediately, her voice firm. "We've managed fine without it." Charles noticed how she positioned herself between him and Malik, a mother's protective instinct still strong. "I'm not offering money," Charles responded, choosing his words carefully. "I want to be part of his life. Part of this community that you've built." He looked at Malik, who sat quietly studying both his parents. Jamila's laugh was sharp. "Now you want to be part of things. Where were you when he had pneumonia at age 3? When he started school? When he won his first math competition?" Each question landed like a blow. Malik interrupted, "But Mom, you never told him. You let everyone think you died in that accident." His words carried no accusation, just stated fact. Charles noticed how mature the boy seemed for his age. "Because I had to protect us," Jamila explained, her voice softening when addressing her son. "You don't understand what it was like back then. How people would have treated us." Charles leaned forward. "She's right, Malik. I handled everything wrong. I was worried about scandal, about my company's image. I forgot what really mattered." He met Jamila's gaze. "But I've spent 8 years learning from that mistake." "Learning doesn't erase consequences," Jamila countered. She pulled out a worn envelope from her bag, spreading photographs across Aisha's desk. "These are the moments you missed. His first steps. First day of school. Every birthday." The images told the story of their son's life, Malik growing from baby to boy, always with Jamila's steady presence beside him. Charles studied each photo, noting details: birthday cakes made from scratch, hand-sewn Halloween costumes, proud smiles at school events. "I can't get these years back," Charles acknowledged. "But I can be here now. Not as Charles Whitmore the CEO, but as someone who wants to learn from both of you." Malik picked up one of the photos, himself at age 5, wearing the elephant necklace for the first time. "Mom always said this was from someone who might come back someday. Someone who needed to learn some important lessons first." Jamila's expression softened slightly. "I never lied to him about you. I told him his father needed time to understand what really matters in life." She straightened some of the photos. "It seems you finally got those lessons." "From you," Charles said quietly. "Everything this community taught me, about dignity, about real help versus handouts, about listening instead of fixing, they're all lessons you tried to teach me years ago." The conversation shifted to practical matters. Malik's education, his activities, his interests. Charles listened intently as Jamila detailed their son's achievements and challenges. Each detail revealed more about the amazing job she'd done as a single mother. "He has your head for numbers," Jamila admitted reluctantly. "Always top of his class in math." Malik beamed at this rare acknowledgement of his connection to Charles. "And your strength," Charles added. "Your sense of justice. I see it in how he stands up for younger kids at the center." They discussed boundaries, supervised visits, involvement in school events, participation in community activities. Jamila remained protective but not unreasonable. Each point was negotiated with their son's best interests at heart. "This doesn't make us a family," Jamila clarified. "This is about Malik having a chance to know his father. Nothing more." The words held a finality that Charles accepted. As they wrapped up, Malik asked if he could show Charles his latest math project. Jamila hesitated, then nodded. Watching them bend over the notebook, talking numbers and equations, she saw what everyone else had been telling her, the undeniable connection between father and son. Aisha, who had remained silent throughout, finally spoke. "Sometimes the hardest walls to break down are the ones we build to protect ourselves." Her words seemed to reach something deep inside Jamila. The meeting ended with no dramatic reconciliation, no easy answers. Just careful steps forward, guided by their son's hope and the community's wisdom. As they left Aisha's office, each carrying pieces of their shared past and uncertain future, the weight of 8 years began to lift, replaced by the possibility of something new. The weeks following the confrontation brought significant changes to the community center. Charles initiated his involvement differently this time, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as Malik's father trying to make amends. He scheduled regular meetings with community leaders to understand their long-term vision. "We need sustainable programs, not quick fixes," Charles announced during a planning session. He presented a detailed proposal that combined his business expertise with Jamila's community-building philosophy. He planned focused on job training, small business development, and educational support. Jamila watched from the sidelines as Charles worked. She noticed how he'd learned to listen before speaking, to ask questions instead of making assumptions. During one meeting, he stopped a consultant who suggested modernizing the center's programs. These programs work because they were built by the community, for the community, he stated firmly. We enhance, not replace. The first test of their new arrangement came when Malik's school hosted a parent-teacher conference. Both Charles and Jamila attended, sitting awkwardly on opposite sides of the classroom. The teacher praised Malik's mathematical abilities and leadership qualities. He organizes study groups for struggling classmates, the teacher explained. Just like his mother does at the community center. Charles noticed Jamila's proud smile, remembering how she'd always helped other housekeepers with their English when she worked for him. Charles threw himself into proving his commitment. He attended every event Malik participated in, always checking with Jamila first. He learned to step back when needed, to share space rather than dominate it. The community watched his efforts with growing acceptance. The fundraising event became his major project, but this time he approached it differently. Instead of simply writing checks, he worked with local businesses and community members to create a sustainable funding model. The event would showcase local talents, support small vendors, and create networking opportunities. This isn't charity, he explained to potential donors. It's investment in human potential. He shared stories of community members who'd started successful businesses, graduates who'd returned to mentor others, families who'd broken cycles of poverty through education and support. Jamila observed his presentations from the back of the room. She noted how he'd adopted her language of empowerment, how he understood now what she'd tried to tell him years ago. The wall between them remained, but it showed hairline cracks. During the planning sessions, their professional interaction remained cordial but distant. Yet both noticed how Malik thrived with their combined influence, his father's strategic thinking melding with his mother's compassionate leadership. The community's response to Charles's efforts varied. Some, like Ms. Rose, embraced his transformation completely. Others remained skeptical but acknowledged his consistency. Aisha maintained her role as bridge builder, facilitating communication between all parties. One evening, while reviewing plans for a new youth mentorship program, Charles found Jamila's original proposal from years ago. Her vision had been clear even then, creating pathways for young people to escape poverty while maintaining their dignity and community ties. You saw all this potential when I could only see problems to solve, he admitted during a committee meeting. Every success here started with your belief in people's capacity to help themselves. The fundraising event grew into something larger than expected. Local artists offered performances, small business owners set up stalls, and community members shared success stories. It became a celebration of everything Jamila had built and everything Charles was learning to understand. Throughout it all, Malik watched his parents navigate their new reality. He spent afternoons doing homework in Charles's office at the center, weekends helping Jamila organize community events. He became the living bridge between their worlds. As the event date approached, Charles worked increasingly long hours at the center. One evening, he overheard Malik asking Jamila, "Do you think Dad's changed enough?" Her response was measured, "Change isn't about being enough. It's about continuing to grow." The words stuck with Charles. He redoubled his efforts, not to prove himself worthy, but to honor the community's trust. Every decision, every interaction, became an opportunity to demonstrate his understanding of true partnership versus patronage. By the month's end, the center's programs had expanded, but more importantly, they deepened their impact. Charles had learned to measure success not in dollars raised, but in lives transformed. He was becoming what Jamila had always believed possible, a man who understood that real change starts with listening to those you want to help. During the fundraising event, the community center buzzed with activity. Local vendors filled the halls with aromatic food, artists displayed their work, and success stories were shared on a small stage. The celebration of community achievement was interrupted when Sarah, a regular participant in Jamila's single mothers program, collapsed near the registration table. Charles reached her first, having been nearby discussing program budgets with donors. Jamila arrived seconds later, immediately taking charge. "She's 7 months pregnant," Jamila informed the gathering crowd. "Someone call an ambulance." The incident triggered a swift response from the community. While waiting for medical help, Charles and Jamila worked together instinctively. He cleared space, she monitored Sarah's breathing. Their synchronized actions spoke of their shared experience in community crisis management. "The ambulance will take 15 minutes, Aisha reported, phone in hand. Sarah's condition appeared to worsen, her breathing becoming labored. The pregnant woman grabbed Jamila's hand, panic in her eyes. "My baby," Sarah whispered. "I can't lose this baby. I can't afford proper care." The words hung heavy in the air, reminiscent of another pregnant woman's fears from years ago. Charles spoke up. "I know the chief of obstetrics at Mount Sinai." He looked at Jamila, seeking approval before continuing. "We can get her the best care, but it needs to be her choice. Her dignity comes first." Jamila's expression shifted, recognizing how different this response was from his reaction to her pregnancy years ago. She nodded, then turned to Sarah. "The choice is yours. Whatever you decide, we'll support you." As they waited for the ambulance, Malik appeared with a cold compress and Sarah's medical information from the center's files. He worked alongside his parents, displaying both Charles's efficiency and Jamila's compassion. The event's attendees witnessed this family unit functioning seamlessly in crisis. Donors observed how their funding translated into real community support. Local members saw how Charles's connections could serve community needs without undermining dignity. In the aftermath of Sarah's departure to the hospital, Charles found himself alone with Jamila in the center's kitchen. They were both cleaning up supplies used during the emergency. The familiar space felt different, charged with unspoken words. "You've really changed," Jamila said quietly, breaking the silence. "The man I knew would have thrown money at the problem and walked away." Her words carried no bitterness, just observation. Charles paused his cleaning. "I had good teachers," he replied. "You, this community, our son." He hesitated before continuing. "Malik isn't just my biological child, is he? He's the embodiment of everything you built here: strength, dignity, compassion." "He's more than that," Jamila responded, meeting his eyes. "He's proof that people can change, that bridges can be built." She placed a hand on the counter between them. When I let everyone believe I died in that accident, it wasn't just about protecting us from scandal. It was about creating a world where our son could grow up proud of both his heritage and his potential." The conversation was interrupted by Malik's return with news about Sarah. The hospital had admitted her, and mother and baby were stable. He noticed his parents standing close, the tension between them different now. "Mom," Malik said, touching the elephant necklace, "remember when you told me this was a symbol of hope? That someday, the person who gave it to you would understand what really matters." Jamila nodded, tears forming in her eyes. Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out the matching pendant he'd carried for 8 years. "I think I finally do understand," he said softly. "It's not about what we build or own. It's about who we become and how we help others become their best selves." The fundraising event resumed around them, but this small family remained in their quiet moment of understanding. No dramatic declarations of love, no fairy tale endings, just 3 people who had found their way to each other through growth, forgiveness, and commitment to something larger than themselves. The community center, with its programs, its challenges, and its successes, stood as testament to their journey. It was more than a building or a set of services. It was proof that transformation was possible, that bridges could be built between different worlds, and that love, in its many forms, could overcome the barriers of class, race, and past mistakes. As they rejoined the event, Malik walking between them, they carried the knowledge that their story wasn't ending, it was evolving into something new, something that would continue to grow and change, just like the community they all served.